Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Rumors of war, this time in the South China Sea. Washington appears, step by step, to be moving away from a policy of engagement with Beijing to one of confrontation. This is a policy approach dangerous for all involved. Attempting to contain China militarily will end in failure. To Crosstalk the South China Sea dispute, I'm joined by my guest, James Bradley in New York. He is a New York Times #1 best-selling author. His latest book is The China Mirage. In Washington, we have Harry Kazianis. He is a senior fellow at the China Policy Institute and author of the new book, The Tao of A2AD. And in Irvine, we cross to Peter Navarro. He is a business professor at UC Irvine and author of Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. James, if I can go to you in New York, we have a war of words, and that's, you know, if it stays that way, it's okay. But it is a war of words between Washington and Beijing. We had Ashton Carter saying China's actions could erect a great wall of self-isolation, and the Chinese spokesperson reacted saying, indeed, there are some in the U.S. who live physically in the 21st century, but whose minds are stuck in the Cold War era. How do you reflect upon those two different statements? Go ahead.
Well, I think we're stuck further back than that. There's a tradition in America of fearing China. China is the country that we love to hate. It was the yellow peril back in the 19th century. For 100 years, the Chinese couldn't even come into the country. They were so dangerous. When I was growing up, there was a theory about China, the domino theory, that China, that if we lost in Vietnam, China was going to gobble up all those Asian countries. Turned out to be a theory that didn't hold water, but there were 4 million dead. I mean, this talk about the South China Sea, I think Professor John Mearsheimer said it well. He said it's the American pattern of aggression that has given rise to China's militaristic behavior. The U.S. has fought 6 separate wars since 1989. The U.S. is addicted to war, and China understands this.
Okay, well, that's a very good introduction. Peter and Irvine, if I can go to you. You've written a book about Chinese militarism. Go ahead and react to what we just heard from James. Please do.
Well, funny thing is, I wrote the book of Crouching Tiger, but I also did a documentary film that the book's based on. And one of the people I interviewed was John Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer was just right to the point about saying that China of today was a hegemon, that it was not only trying to push the United States out of the Western Pacific, it was trying to take territory from its neighbors in the South China Sea, from the Japan and the East China Sea. It's trying to take Taiwan. It's trying to take Arunachal Pradesh from the Indians. And so for James to quote John Mearsheimer, I think that's a bad start, my friend, because Mearsheimer, above all people, is worried that China is going to be very, very overly aggressive towards the rest of the world. And the other thing I'd recommend for James is to just go through the inventory. Hang on, James. All right. Go through the inventory of Chinese capabilities these days. Largest missile arsenal in the world, fastest growing fleet of submarines, largest inventory of mines. They've stolen the F-35 and F-22 fifth-generation fighter designs, and they're flying their Chengdu jet fighters now. They are an offensive-minded military
all right.
power.
Peter, you've made your point. Let me go to Harry, so we get everybody in the program first here. Okay, Harry, you've heard James and you've heard Peter, but one thing that Peter didn't mention is the American military presence in the Pacific and the so-called pivot there. I mean, if you have a massive military establishment moving in your direction, what would you do? Probably pretty much what China's doing. Go ahead, Harry.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I guess what I would say is that a lot of that military power is to reinforce alliances. It certainly is not all aimed at China. A lot of it's based in Japan. There's obviously concerns about North Korea, their missile program, their nuclear program, chemical, biological weapons. So there's huge concerns there. But I think the broader point, when we talk about the U.S.-China relationship, there's 2 U.S.-China relationships we need to consider. The first is the economic relationship, which in many respects has made both countries rich. rich. It's worth over $600 billion in bilateral trade. Huge, huge relationship, perhaps the biggest in the world. And then we have the strategic relationship, which is coming undone very rapidly. There are multiple different points of intersection between the United States and China, whether we're talking the Senkaku Daio Islands in the East China Sea, now over Taiwan again, which is quickly becoming a flashpoint, and now in the South China Sea. And I would argue in a lot of these different flashpoints, it's been Beijing that's been pushing and trying to alter the status quo. And I think that's something the United States has been reacting to.
Well,
I
but
think
at the
it's
same
something
time,
that our
Harry,
leaders, and especially
at the same time, Harry, you'd say the United States is establishing the rules right there. I mean, the Chinese are saying, well, we can jointly establish rules here. I mean, why should it be the United States to establish its certain zone of interest here when it is at the expense of the Chinese? I mean, I'm for dialogue here. Okay, James, do you want to jump in? What Harry had to say and what Peter had to say, because there's a lot to chew on there. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, Gallup did an international poll last year, and they questioned the world, who's the most dangerous country in terms of world peace, and number one was the United States. China was far down the list. So our guests can talk about all the new military capability of China, but we're talking about a situation that's 6,000 miles away from the United States. It's almost a joke to talk about Chinese aggression when America power is thrust 6,000 miles away from our shores right to their shores. I mean, how does America take bases? Diego Garcia, we just shot the people's dogs and then wiped them off the island and deposited them in Africa. So I think the aggressor here is, as Mearsheimer says, and I believe, the United States and the South China Sea. Okay,
Peter, you're the opposite. Go right ahead, please. That's a debate. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, let's talk about geography. Let me remind James, there was something called Pearl Harbor in 1941 when the Imperial Japan basically pushed their empire all the way to Hawaii. That was 60 years. I mean, look, today, North Korea is rapidly developing the capability to reach the west coast of America with Chinese-made nuclear missiles. China has, on their public TV, by the way, you can see simulations of nuclear attacks on New York City. That's what they show on public TV in China. So the idea that 6,000 or 7,000 miles is a long distance these days is silly in an age of intercontinental ballistic missiles. I think, for the Russian people watching this, I think it might be important.
This is an international audience, Peter. Okay, this is in English, so speak to the whole world.
Well,
go right ahead.
Yeah, but I want to look at it through the historical prism of China's revanchist claims. I mean, much of what China is doing is an attempt to rewrite the rules in terms of territory in Asia. And if you think about, for example, Far East Russia and Vladivostok, that was taken from China in the 1850s during China's so-called century of humiliation. And I guess it would be really interesting if China is successful in taking 80% of the South China Sea and taking Taiwan and taking the Senkaku Islands from Japan, and it moved on to say wanting Vladivostok on the same kind of historical claims. What would Russia do? Would Russia be doing the same kind of things?
But Peter, that's a very interesting hypothetical. That's an interesting hypothetical. But the first time I've ever heard of that hypothetical is coming from you here. I don't think that's on the agenda here. And we're talking about the South China Sea. Let's worry about one problem after another here.
But we're talking about
China's.
I see your point. Revanchist claims.
Okay, let's talk about those claims. Harry,
we're talking about China.
Let me go to Harry, please. Equal time for everyone, please. Okay, Harry. I mean, does China, and China has presented very clearly that it has claims in the South China Sea, and it hasn't used military force to get it back, but it's certainly making a claim, and other countries are making a claim as well. I mean, is it aggressive to make a claim? Go ahead, Harry.
Well, let's talk about China's claims. And Peter brought up the issue of maps. I would argue China is doing something called mapfare, kind of like warfare, lawfare, some of these other catchy political science terms that are going around. Basically, what the Chinese have done a couple of years back has drawn what's called a 9-dash line. Basically, what that is, it's a line that goes from Taiwan all the way to the very southern edges of the South China Sea, almost to Indonesia. And basically, what they've done is drawn a line in the maps that they put out all over the world, in China, in their embassies, whatever, basically declaring this is our territory. Now, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this is what countries did, but that is a settled part of international law. I mean, think about it. Take a step back. When you go on a cruise, when you go on a boat, when you do something recreational in the ocean, you don't think for a second, oh, this is U.S. territory or Chinese territory. The oceans are a common space. And I think what a lot of people are extremely concerned about is when another great power, as powerful as China, is literally drawing lines in maps saying oceans are our territory, these are our sovereign waters. And then on top of that, going in and taking submerged rocks, reefs, islands, building them up and making them into military bases, and then furthermore, putting airfields on them, rotating advanced fighter jets,
but Harry,
putting air defense
all of those
assets
things, Harry,
in.
all of those
That's
things
a
are
huge
happening.
problem.
All of those things are happening. But at the same time, you have a Pentagon official saying that they will sail anywhere, anytime they want. Now, that's an affront to some definitions of sovereignty of other countries, namely China. Why doesn't the United States and China cooperate on dealing with that instead of making it a unilateral statement? Harry, let me finish with Harry, and then we'll go to the break here. Okay, go ahead, Harry.
I definitely think there's room for cooperation. And I mean, the United States and China are cooperating. We wouldn't have a $600 billion bilateral trade relationship. But I think the point is this. China plays by those same rules. I mean, I'll give you a clear example. China certainly sails and flies where it wants to. China just last year sailed through the Aleutian Islands right in Alaska. The United States wasn't worried about it. Back in 2014, when China was invited to RIMPAC in Hawaii, Chinese spy ships were within the EEZ of Hawaii. The United States didn't throw them out. These are the common rules of the road, and China can't have it both ways.
Okay, that's a good point, but we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the South China Sea. Stay with RT. Okay, James, I'd like to go back to you in New York. Recently, Ashton Carter, this defense secretary, he was in India and signing a number of agreements that could deal with different elements of security and logistics and whatnot. And then you have President Obama visiting China and ending the arms embargo there. And then you have the State Department and the Pentagon saying, but this is not directed against China. I mean, are we all supposed to believe that? Because the Chinese certainly don't. Go ahead.
Well, they certainly don't. I mean, we're encircling China. If you look at the New York Times every day, you can see wonderful interactive maps about those spits of land that China's reclaiming in the South China Sea. They don't open the lens, as many of our commentators don't, and talk about the huge bases that we're using to surround China. I mean, have you heard of Talisman Sabre? Last year, we had 30,000 American troops and Australian troops out on war exercises in the Malacca Straits. That's pretty sensitive. The New York Times didn't mention it. Washington Post didn't mention it. A Greens Party leader said most people join the Australian Defence Force to defend Australia. Now with America, we're training to invade another country. He said, I don't think Australia should be preparing for war with China with the Americans.
Okay, Peter, would you like to react to that? And Irvine, go ahead.
Sure. I think it's important to recognize what's happened in the last 10 years. 2008 seemed to be a watershed for China. It abandoned its peaceful rise. It began what has been a process of flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, border incursions in India. This whole issue of American bases in Asia is in large part a response to that aggression. And if you go country by country, you take Vietnam, for example. You just mentioned that Vietnam had its arms embargo lifted. I mean, America had a huge naval base at Cam Ranh Bay. It's one of the finest harbors in the world. Why does Vietnam fear China? Vietnam fears China because China has pushed its fishing boats further and further out to sea. It's basically taken its oil rights. It took the Paracel Islands from Vietnam. It's been taking its water from the Tibetan Plateau that would otherwise flow down the Mekong. So Vietnam sees China as an aggressive bully and is looking for U.S. help. If you look at, for example, the Philippines, Scarborough Shoal, second Thomas Shoal,
do you think the United States
Philippines wants us back at Subic Bay?
Let's talk about the Philippines. Let's talk about Vietnam.
Go ahead.
Do you think the United States should take on those security obligations and other countries in the Pacific?
You know, that's a fascinating question, and I think it's one for this 2016 presidential campaign because, you know, there is the argument of neo-isolation and we should withdraw, but I think the lesson the American people learned from Imperial Japan and Pearl Harbor, that isolationism usually ends in war. And the problem here is that Asia is the fastest growing market in the world. America is a trading nation. We trade with Japan, South Korea. There's 650 million people in Southeast Asia. These people want democracy, freedom of navigation. They look to America for leadership
all the countries,
on that.
Peter,
and
that you
it's been
just
good
mentioned,
so far.
all the countries you just mentioned, Peter, also trade with China. Let's not forget that also. Harry, if I can go to you, one of the interesting things is that one can look. Let me please go to Harry, please. Equal time for each guest.
Sure.
Harry, one of the interesting things is that, you know, when you look at all of these different security arrangements with these countries the United States has in the region here, I mean, one can make the argument also is that they're using this for extra leverage when they're dealing with China because they think they have America on its back here. That can create dangers for the United States of having too many complicated diplomatic and security arrangements there. Then you become, you know, wag the dog situation here. I see the countries in the region trying to grasp for that, okay? They all have to deal with China. They all have trade with China, and I don't think any of them want to see that trade go away. Go ahead, Harry.
Sure, I think that's a great point, but I think you also have to sort of flip the script for a moment. The same situation also, China has to think about that as well. I mean, I don't think China wants any sort of shooting war or conflict with the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, whoever. But at the same time, I don't think they want to see the United States also come in and make more security guarantees. For example, there's a lot of talk about this partnership between Vietnam and the United States. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Go back to the 1960s and early 1970s. They were shooting at each other. I mean, my grandfather was a veteran of the Vietnam War. So think about how much has changed in Asia. Obviously, a lot of years has passed, but for the United States and Vietnam to be getting so close, for the United States now to be offering arms sales to Vietnam, some of the most advanced weapons in the world, I think that shows where the region is heading. And I think China needs to be very careful about its next moves. I don't think China has any interest in becoming an isolated great power. Now, it won't be completely isolated because it's the second largest economy in the world, but I don't think China has any interest in going any further with any of these territorial claims. They're seeing the region align against them, and that's a very, very dangerous thing.
Okay, James, if I go to you, I mean, we heard about these bases in the Pacific and in the region here. I mean, they didn't come into being in the last 10 years. I mean, most have been there for a very long time. It's China that is reacting to what I would say is American militarism. You know, one can make that argument as well. Go ahead, James.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt moved the western boundary of the United States out to China's coast in 1898, and we've had millions dead since then. I mean, the so-called China hands, I wrote a book, The China Mirage. It's about 100 years of China hands trying to scare us about China, and we have reacted incorrectly, and millions have died. This fear of China, I think, is overblown. And on the other hand, I think if I was in Beijing looking at American bases encircling me, and the U.S. Navy, you know, in this Talisman military exercise, one of the ships was the USS Green Bay. I'm from Wisconsin. The air deck is called Lambeau Field, so you can have fun with war out there near China. China has things to worry about.
Okay, Peter, I mean, there seems to be, is there a movement away from cooperation to confrontation? Because my reading of it at times is that the Chinese just want to have more respect, and maybe the U.S. and China could work together to keep the sea lanes free and whatnot, because, I mean, China has more interest than any other country in the world to have free navigation, because, for goodness sake, they're the factory of the world. I mean, why can't there be more cooperation between the U.S. and China as two major powers in the region, or in that area right there, and just work together more? Because when I look at the Chinese position, and I'm not going to say I necessarily agree with it, but I'm looking at their rhetoric and trying to understand how they see things. Could the United States and China be working more closely together instead of sparring with each other? Go ahead, Peter and Irvine.
Sure. One of the people I interviewed for the Crouching Tiger book and film was Kurt Campbell, who was Hillary Clinton's second in command. He basically wrote the Pivot to Asia policy. And the most interesting thing I found about that discussion was the stark difference between how China negotiates and sees the world versus the U.S. And Campbell basically explained that we like to show our power here in America. We like to put everything on the table, whereas China is totally non-transparent. They make you want to think about what they might have, but they never tell you what they do. And the problem we have now is that's leading to a negotiating stalemate in places like the East and South China Sea. The other thing is, this whole thing about bridge-to-bridge communication. Again, I'll give you a Cold War analogy. During the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S., we had excellent bridge-to-bridge communication between Soviet and American ships, and as a result, we were able to avoid confrontations, collisions, and the like. We don't have that with China because China, not the U.S., China does not want that, and so we raise the specter of possible tripwires for war. We've already had one in 2000 with the P-3 incident. We've had Chinese jets basically do loop-arounds on American planes right now. And so my point, Peter, is that there's a culture gap here. The other thing I would say with respect to what China's doing, I agree with Harry, China's inviting this. I mean, we must remember that the last Vietnam War was not with America, it was with China in 1979, and more troops on the Chinese side died in a matter of 2 weeks than all of Americans died during their Vietnam War. And Vietnam fears China, and I think rightly, and China's pushing everybody into American arms, even as those countries are trying to work economically with China. It's the conundrum of our time.
You know, Harry, one of the things is that, a lot of Cold War rhetoric, the reference to the Cold War itself, and then the word containment and all that. And I think it's really off base, because you can't contain China the way the Soviet Union was contained, because the U.S. had virtually no trade with the Soviet Union whatsoever. So there was no leverage right there. And then isolation, I go back to that quote, China's actions could erect a great wall of self-isolation. I mean, really, that's projecting. It's called a policy of containment, and that policy certainly won't work the way it used to. You have to have a whole set of new tools to deal with each other, because a Cold War analogy just doesn't work. Go ahead, Harry. Give you the last moment on the program. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't think the United States can contain China. I mean, think about how integrated the world economy is with China. That's completely impossible and irrational. If you're talking about military containment, I don't think that's really a plausible strategy either, considering the advanced weaponry the Chinese has. I mean, they're developing things like carrier killer missiles that in theory could strike a U.S. carrier 2,500 miles away. But I also want to just jump back to James's point in talking about the history between the United States and China. Yes, I think there is in many respects a sort of a history trap where both sides don't have great understandings of each other. Obviously, there's tremendous cultural barriers for such things. But we also have to keep in mind, the United States did everything it could in the early 1970s to open China up to the world. The United States helped China get entrance into the World Trade Organization. So the United States has done a lot of things to try and bring Beijing into the international system. Now, for whatever reason, Beijing has a different approach where it feels it wants to change the status quo.
Okay,
and I think, again,
gentlemen, I have to jump in here. I have to jump in here.
You can see that clearly.
We've run out of time. I'm sure China wants to be part of the world. It just wants a more equitable stake in the world and not rules made by someone else. Many thanks to my guests in New York, Washington, and in Irvine. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.